Once upon a time, once upon a time there were so many ancient stories, sacred and profane. Books that filled the imagination of the West. And in the early days of archaeology, people set out to excavate the treasures that these ancient books described. But were they true? The most powerful of these legends were ancient Greek. Favourite amongst them, the Iliad, a poem of war, chivalry and seduction, written, so it's said, some 27 centuries ago by the poet Homer. Homer sang of bloody battles between the armies of the Greeks and the people of a great walled city, ancient Troy. They fought over a woman, Homer said, beautiful Queen Helen, who'd abandoned her Greek husband to run away to Troy with one of the sons of Priam, the king of that great city. The first archaeologist to use the words of ancient books to tell him where to dig was a German, Heinrich Schliemann. In January 1891, after 20 sensational years of excavation far from his homeland, he was laid to rest in the main cemetery of Athens, Greece. This is the tomb of Indiana Jones, the real, the one original Indiana Jones, the man who made archaeology so sexy a subject that 100 years ago, quite suddenly, it went on every schoolboy's dream list along with train driving and being a soldier. His name's up there, look, in Greek. I cover Heinrich Schliemann, it says. Wouldn't have made it in Hollywood with a name like that, would he? But then he wouldn't have made it in Hollywood anyway. He was a little man, he looked like a bank clerk, he had a humpback and no hair.
If Indiana Jones was inspired by old war movies and Saturday morning pictures, Schliemann was inspired by much more ancient adventure stories. He loved Greek and Roman texts, especially those that told of great wars and warriors and battles. He saw his own life as a heroic career, just like the warriors he had on his tomb, spearing adversaries, always getting ahead, in league with the gods, and above all, making money. Heinrich was the archetypal 19th century capitalist. At 28, he was in California in the gold rush. At 40, he cornered the world's indigo market. Nearing 50, he retired. At an income of about $250,000 a year, he came to live in Athens and he devoted himself to archaeology. That's Schliemann up there, with his wife, Sophie. They're excavating Troy together, the city that made him famous, the city of Homer's heroes. He was a passionate man. It's said that when he found a particularly lovely piece of evidence, he made love to his wife on the spot in antiquarian ecstasy. It's all down to the marble book he's holding in his hand. It's a book of Homer. He used Homer quite literally. He believed its every word. The book holds the clues to find the place, said Schliemann. It's called program archaeology. You read a text, you search its clues, and you go off and you look for it.
Beneath the walls of Troy there lie two streams. One flows hot, and from the water fumes arise as though from fire. Even in summer the other gushes chill as hail or snow or crystal ice on frozen water. Near these two springs are wide washing boards of smooth-laid stone, where Trojan wives and daughters laundered their fine linen in the days of peace, before the coming of the Greeks.
In October 1871, Schliemann, Sophie and a camel train came here to western Turkey to search for the legendary city of Troy. A beginner in archaeology, it was his first long field trip. Schliemann had studied the literary landscapes of Homer's poems for years. Now at last, he walked across the very fields that tradition said had been the battleground of ancient Troy. Was this the lonely beach where once upon a time the boats of Homer's Greeks had come ashore. Were these great mounds the tomb of Homer's ancient heroes killed in battle? Above all, though, where were the ruins of the city of old Troy, the great walled fortress destroyed, so ancient poets sung, by the armies of the vengeful Greeks? After months of searching, a farmer told Schliemann of a hill with ancient ruins on it, a hill called Hissarlik, the Towers. Schliemann quickly saw that the hill of Hissarlik, close by two small rivers, exactly fitted Homer's description of the location of ancient Troy. Here, then, he would dig, and as he dug, he changed the world of archaeology forever. It was the first time that any archaeologist had ever dug into one of those common Middle Eastern mounds that Arabs call a tell. These little pinnacles marked the mound's full height before Schliemann started work. Since Schliemann's day, excavations in these mounds, made of ancient ruined cities built one upon the other, have told us more about the Middle Eastern past than any other single source.
Schliemann and his workmen dug this enormous trench. They were digging back into a past that nobody had ever seen before. Nobody had ever done anything like this. Nobody knew how old it was, who'd been the people who made these walls, nothing. Well, Schliemann came down with his notebook and he carefully copied all the pots he found and all the bits of metal and the jewellery and everything else. But in reality, he was destroying the very thing he'd come to find. He was digging away the houses. Those there are not house walls, but foundations.
Fortunately, Schliemann compulsively measured and described almost everything he came in contact with and wrote the information down in notebooks. Good training for an archaeologist.
This is Schliemann's diaries from the 3rd season of his excavation at Troy. There's about 2 or 3 pages to each day of working. Here's Schliemann drawing away. Spindle whorls, very interested in the designs, mixed up with pottery and pins for dresses there. Ages and periods are a bit of a mystery to him at this point. Funny moving through his actual words. If you blow down the middle of the book, a little bit of the dust of Troy comes out.
Schliemann was a natural archaeologist, and like all successful archaeologists, he was also very lucky. That 3rd season, besides some great stone walls he'd excavated, the very walls he thought of good King Priam's Troy, he found something that brought old Homer's ancient tales right back to life again.
Here on this very spot, early in 1873, the world's first great archaeological treasure was found. Schliemann found it and reported it immediately to the Times of London. The news went round the world and it was a tremendous sensation. He said that the treasure of King Priam had been found in a wooden box left behind as the Trojans fled their burning city. What's really nice is that in the last year or two, this whole area has been re-excavated. So for the first time, you can actually stand in the same spot that Schliemann once stood. He was all alone. He'd sent the workmen off for an early breakfast, so he could do this in great secrecy. Here, by himself, he dug with his knife from the ashy earth of Troy 9,000 objects of pure gold.
Schliemann secretly took his treasure home to Athens and built himself a city house, Iliad, Palace of Troy. A house to hold his Trojan treasures, his library, his children, and beloved Sophie too, who wore the ancient gold of Troy to dinner parties. Like so many private treasures, It's scattered now around the world. Most romantic Schliemann. His house is the greatest monument to archaeology the world has ever seen. A palace planned around the joys of scholarship and excavation, modelled on the ancient Roman houses of Pompeii, whose discovery had first inspired his excavations. On the floor, mosaic images copied from his Trojan notebooks. On the ceilings, cherubic sophies and Heinrichs play and excavate the ancient past. And as they play, they oversee the birth of Middle Eastern archaeology. Unable to excavate in Turkey, for the Turkish government was suing for its stolen treasure, Heinrich Schliemann, by now the world's most famous archaeologist, turned his attention to the land from which the armies of the ancient Greeks had sailed to Troy. To that most ancient city deeply stained by tales of fratricidal killing. The city where, so Homer said, King Agamemnon, the leader of the Greeks at Troy, had lived and ruled, was butchered and was buried.
Mr. and Mrs. Schliemann rode into Mycenae on August the 7th, 1879. There they are on their horses, going along, 2 or 3 servants coming up behind, not too worried about where they're going to stay. And Schliemann all the time thinking about the treasure, looking at those ancient books.
In just 3 months, on this remote hill in southern Greece, Schliemann found the treasure of his dreams and 1,000 years of unknown European history. The ancient city of Mycenae was always known, a site that was never lost from view. Travellers had come here long before Schliemann's day. Though no one had ever tried to dig it up, the great high fortress standing on its rock was famous since the days of Homer.
Schliemann actually had to dig his way through this gate. The earth came up to within a couple of feet of its top. Actually, he had to dig out practically all of the entrance corridor too. 125 men were digging here for 2 months. I don't suppose he would have minded though. You got to think, the man's head is full of heroes. He's walking on the very stones that were polished by his Trojan heroes. He can see the silks being thrown across the ground as Agamemnon strode home from Troy to be murdered on the Acropolis and buried just inside the gate, as the ancient Greek guidebook said. Of course, only Schliemann believed that, but he was utterly confident in him and his Greeks.
This would have looked quite different in Schliemann's day, when the whole area was covered by a gentle slope of earth. Not a good place to look for tombs, other archaeologists would have said. Yet Schliemann believed the writings of the ancient Greeks and set his men to dig a series of holes along the inside of the city wall.
Schliemann's workmen must have hit natural rock about here somewhere. No houses at any rate. But look what they found here. You see this dead straight edge. Just a couple of metres away, another lovely straight edge, a shaft. It was full of earth and Schliemann started to dig down in it. Bits of gold started to come up, very suggestive little bits of pot. But then it started to rain. It was December, they'd been working 2 months, and the hole filled up with water, so Schliemann left that and moved over here a bit. Because you see, here too, he'd found a lovely sharp edge. What he'd found was a second great shaft. And this one drained rather better, and as the men dug down in it, the water went away before them. Schliemann cleared it all out. He went down, and laying here, side by side, were 3 bodies, all men, all crouched in sleep, with their heads towards the east. Extraordinary find, not because there were 3 bodies, but because between them they were wearing 15 golden crowns. Those had been great kings, along with the crowns. He'd found their spears, their swords, and above all, their wine cups. He found another shaft, a much smaller shaft, but in there were not 3 people, but 5. 3 women laying side by side. They had wonderful pots of crystal, gold and silver. They had the wine cups, and they had 2 dead babies completely wrapped in gold foil. In this grave here, the one he dug next, he found another 5 people. The men had great gold masks on their face.
The masks that we now call the Masks of Agamemnon. This was where Schliemann started to enter into legend. These were pictures of his Trojan heroes.
Three golden crowns, 3 gold girdles, 1 small wine jar of gold, 1 vase with 2 handles, 1 large bracelet weighing at least 100 grams, 2 gold finger rings, 1 golden helmet, 3 large breastplates, 25 arrows of silver. After Schliemann packed up the treasures from all these tombs, he sent a telegram to the King of Greece, and it said, "Your Majesty, I found the fabled tombs of Greece's ancient kings, and I present you with your treasure, 35 pounds of solid gold." He hoped this treasure would be the foundation of Greece's national prosperity. So it's proved, of course, with the tourist industry. So you might think, how on earth was Schliemann going to top that? Well, he had the last tomb to find. The water had drained out, just seemed to be earth in it. And in that earth, Schliemann found something yet more remarkable. You see, what he found here was 3 more burials, 3 more kings perhaps, laying quietly in the ground as if they were sleeping. He noticed the middle one may have been robbed, but the other 2 were still wearing golden masks. Now, the real treasure in this tomb wasn't in the gold, you see, because what he found here when he lifted the masks up was that the faces and bodies of the kings were perfectly preserved. Now, this was extraordinary. I mean, imagine the luck of this man. He goes out with Homer in his hand to find the Trojan heroes, and he ends up looking into their faces.
Schliemann had done it again. And ancient Mycenae joined the map of world tourism, of things to see before you die. Even the house where, so local legend says, the Schliemann stayed whilst they dug the golden graves became a place of international pilgrimage.
Well, didn't have double glazing last time.
I stayed here when I first visited Mycenae in the 60s, and I was absolutely thrilled.
There it is, though. The House of Schliemann, established 1862. Dr. Schliemann's room. Perhaps he went out through the window, eh? Actually, Schliemann is really as elusive as his excavation house. He told so many stories about himself, so many myths and legends that he threaded into those heroic dramas about the Trojan Wars. He's a difficult man to find. Carl Jung, Henry Moore, Ben Nicholson, Virginia Woolf, Arthur Rubinstein, the pianist, Debussy, Himmler, Goebbels, Göring, Agatha Christie, William Faulkner, Allen Ginsberg, Curzio Malaparte, Alberto Moravia, every archaeologist under the sun, every professor, intellectual tourists. It's an amazing list of names. I mean, Schliemann made the place famous and popular with his letters and his articles to the Times. I mean, this man publicised archaeology beyond words, and the dream went out from this funny little eccentric man and conquered the Western world, and Mycenae is now a part of our history. Millions come to see it.
In the end, Schliemann became more than a publicist, more than a jewellery thief or a plunderer of ancient graves and cities. In the end, he became an honest scholar. After Mycenae, the big archaeological problem he faced was that the treasures he'd found in the shaft graves were nothing like the things he'd found earlier in Troy. The two ancient cities, Turkish Troy and Greek Mycenae, were utterly different, not just in their treasures, but in the ordinary things of daily life. Schliemann, in fact, had found no proof of their connection whatsoever, no buried texts, nothing at all. Doubts grew within him. Was his Troy really Homer's Troy at all? After settling with the Turkish government, Schliemann went back again to Troy with German archaeologists to dig not for yet more gold, but to scientifically map and study his earlier excavations in a search for clues. As they went about this careful work, though, old Schliemann, who'd always dug fast for quick results, became impatient.
The old man decided to do a bit of new excavation all by himself. Brought a gang of workmen up here onto the hill just by the gate where all those years before he'd found the great treasure of Troy. Now he was looking for royal tombs. Well, he didn't find any. What he did find was more precious than gold. He found this great house from a much later period than the city he'd been working in before, but in it he found the answer to his quest to find Homer's Troy. What he'd found was a pot similar to those he dug up at Mycenae, where he thought the Greek heroes had come from. He'd never found anything like it in Troy. That was what really aggravated him, what drove him on. What was the connection between this city here and the Greek heroes that he'd found in Greece? Well, this was it. He'd found the Troy, the level of Troy, from Homer's heroes.
Or at least, the level of Troy that dated to the same time as the golden burials at Mycenae. To his eternal credit, Schliemann saw that the famous treasure he'd found by the city walls had not come from King Priam's Troy, but from an earlier, utterly anonymous period of the city's history. King Priam's treasure was not King Priam's treasure after all.
He told his young architects later that week when they were sitting in a tent together. But he never published it. Schliemann was very, very ill. He was nearly 70 and he'd had a major ear problem for the last 10 years of his life. He died shortly after, all alone and in great pain.
In the end, had Schliemann really uncovered Homer's Troy, city of those ancient heroes? Though modern archaeologists have generally agreed to call this ancient city Homer's Troy, in truth, they've found no proof at all. Today, the ancient books and modern archaeology are as far apart as ever. A year after Schliemann's death, a young British archaeologist called Flinders Petrie came to Athens especially to study the pottery that Schliemann had excavated at Troy and at Mycenae. Petrie had excavated some of this same distinctive pottery on his Egyptian excavations. Thanks to Egyptian hieroglyphs and ancient histories, he was now able to give precise dates to these pots, which he believed to have been exported from most ancient Greece. This meant, then, that the graves that Schliemann had excavated at Mycenae and the house he'd found at Troy had been made at the same time, that is, about 15 centuries BC. Petrie's imaginative leap from ancient Egypt into unknown ancient Greece and Turkey had given world archaeology a revolutionary tool, a way of making real history from little bits of broken pot. The first to call on his skills were Christian archaeologists, who wished to set not Homer's poems, but the books of the Bible into real history. In 1890, they invited Petrie to the Holy Land to excavate. A Londoner, largely self-trained, at once bohemian and incredibly hard-working, Petrie was at the very height of his powers, one of the greatest field archaeologists who has ever lived, and a key figure in archaeological history. Working alone, he began by searching for a place to dig, one that would not require the same vast expenditure of time and money as Schliemann's search for Homer's heroes had. Craftily, he picked this place, Tel El Hessi, the mound by the river Hessi, where the river had eroded half a hillside, exposing its strata to the sun.
That's exactly what Petrie would have been looking for. You see, it's not a natural cliff at all. It's actually made out of mud bricks. And immediately he whipped his penknife out and started looking for little bits of pot round here. There's a bit. That's a huge piece of pottery. Petrie would have never seen anything like that before in his life. He knew it was old. He named it after a tribe in a book, the Bible. He called it Amorite pottery.
Further up the mound, he found fragments of the same pottery that he'd already dated in Egypt and Mycenae to around 1500 years BC. It was the first datable thing he'd found buried in the mound. It meant that everything underneath the stratum that held the pottery was older than 1500 BC.
Above this, Petrie was in good territory. There was Greek pottery and then there was Roman pottery. That was easily dated. This meant that these layers here dated from 1400 BC upwards of 1,000 years. Now look at your Bible and you'll find that's where this is. Ramesses and the Exodus, Moses, David, Solomon. He'd opened up the strata of this mound like the pages of a book, the Bible. But he was a good scientist, so he didn't leap in and call it the pottery of Solomon, even though he could have dug this lump out here, say, and wondered whether King David had ever used it for a drinking cup. He didn't do that. He simply called it Israelite because he was a scientist. And to scientists, neither Solomon nor David had ever existed at this time.
After Petrie had finished his excavations at Tel El Hessi, he made an archaeological map, which is the first ever made of a tell, showing every stratum and dating every stratum by the pottery within it. He'd made a time chart for the archaeology of Palestine.
But you know, Petrie was that most unfashionable thing. He was actually a genius. One of the things he could do was hold thousands of colours and textures and shapes in his head and organise them all with the crushing logic of the computer until these pots went into patterns and periods, whole dynasties of pottery, whole eras of history. Greece, Palestine, Egypt, they were all put together by this single man, 37 years old, working in the field for 10 years when he came here. He wasn't living in the Hilton either. He lived in a tent over there on the plain.
he had deadly black scorpions to contend with. His water had to come from 6 miles away. Here, he did an extraordinary thing. He opened up the pages of the Bible to archaeologists, and the hunt for David and Solomon was on. Like Heinrich Schliemann, Petrie was a lucky archaeologist. Just a few years after Tel el-Hesi, excavating in Egyptian Thebes, he stumbled quite by chance on the next important piece of evidence in the archaeological exploration of the Bible. Petrie and Hilda, his wife, set up house in the temple called the Ramesseum. Together with 200 workmen, they were looking for buried temples. So Petrie took his 200 workmen and they started to dig south from the Ramesseum in a great sway through the desert at just the point where it met the fields. Petrie thought there would be royal temples there, and there were. He and his men dug through 6 of them, one after another, but they'd all been smashed to pieces. He found a couple of sculptures, but by the time he got to the 6th one, he was getting a bit bored. And then suddenly, in the dirt, he found 2 really interesting things. 2 huge stones, something like this one. Now this is a bit of a statue, but the ones he found were called stelae. That is hieroglyphic texts engraved on huge stones to be set up inside the temple. One of them had fallen over, so the hieroglyphs was on the top. And the young German student Petrie had along to read the hieroglyphs could easily read a text about the pharaoh fighting in battles. The other one, though, the hieroglyphs had fallen face down with the stele and they were underneath it. So, being Flinders Petrie, he got his men to dig a great tunnel under the big stone, which he couldn't really move, and encouraged the young German to go underneath to see what he could see. So the bloke went in with a light, and Petrie said, well, what's there? And there were sort of fumblings and scrapings around. And the young student said, well, it's a list of names of Syrian cities that Pharaoh has conquered. And Petrie said, well, what about it? And he said, well, I know them all. It's quite a common text, but there's one on it which I've never seen before. It's the town, and then he read out the hieroglyphs, letter by letter. Isira'ah. And Petrie listened and said, why, that's Israel. And the young German student replied, well, so it is, and won't the reverends be pleased? Petrie had found proof that at the time this stele had been made, that is, about 1300 BC, a tribe named Israel had been conquered by an Egyptian pharaoh. At last, the tribe of Israel had made an appearance outside the pages of the Holy Book. The Bible's ancient literary world was finally touched by the realities of archaeology. Now, the eyes of many archaeologists turn to Jerusalem, the place where Jesus Christ was crucified, where Abraham offered Isaac up in sacrifice, where the prophet Muhammad had ascended into paradise. What unimagined relics might lie beneath its ancient streets? Its every stone seemed to reflect the Bible's ancient words and images. Jerusalem has always attracted hosts of archaeologists down through the years, from Flinders Petrie's finest students to ardent fundamentalists whose idea of archaeology goes strictly by the Holy Book. Following a dream of General Gordon of Khartoum, some archaeologically minded Protestants suggested that the resting place of Jesus is this ancient tomb, beside this cliff in which the general thought he saw the image of a skull, the biblical Golgotha.
You have the tomb.
We have the tomb, and that's the centrepiece, really, of the garden. Here you have the channel where the rolling stone would have been, and it could have weighed between 5 and 6 tons. Goodness. Which helps you to understand why the women were saying, who will move the stone for us? Yes, yes. Because it was a low door, when Peter and John came running to the tomb, what did they have to do? It says in the scriptures, they had to stoop to look in. It's only a detail, but it's the mark of an eyewitness. When they came that first Easter morning, they found the guard had fled, the stone was rolled away, and the tomb was empty, yet not quite empty. There were two shining angels, one at the head and one at the foot, and they were saying to the confused disciples, "Why are you seeking the living amongst the dead? He's not here, he is risen." And that's the great thing about the tomb of Jesus, it is empty. And so we always say to our visitors, it's much more important to have a personal faith in our risen Lord than to try and locate the place where his body might have been put.
An archaeology to bait the hook of faith. A quarter-mile from the Protestant Garden Tomb, however, is the traditional side of Jesus' tomb, sheltered since the 3rd century by the stones of this strange old church, the Holy Sepulchre. And what, you might ask, has Flinders Petrie's science to say to all of this? Only that the date of the tomb itself is part verified by archaeology. As some of Petrie's students recognised, the gilt and marble of the church covers the remains of a middle-class cemetery of a type common in the 1st century AD. And that's it, really. Here, the gap between the written word and archaeology is even wider than it was at Schliemann's Troy. Nonetheless, Petrie's science still has something quite unique to tell us about the Bible. And in the 1960s, in Old Jerusalem, archaeology underlined this contribution in the most unexpected way.
Now there is at Jerusalem a pool, which is called in the Hebrew tongue Bethesda, having 5 porches. In these lay a great multitude of sick people, blind, halt, and withered, waiting for the moving of the water.
Archaeologists have proved that when Jesus walked the earth, these steps I'm walking down were about 200 years old. They're part of an ancient hospital, sort of healing sanctuaries. And they're all over the Greco-Roman world, from Bath in England to the borders of Persia practically. In this one, there are 5 of these little cells, and they're fed by water from a great cistern over there. The water comes in down here and lays on the ground. Quite commonly in these places, there were magic moments when the water rippled, and the first person to touch the water would be healed.
And a man was there who'd been ill for 38 years. When Jesus saw him, he knew he'd been a long time in that place, and said unto him, Wilt thou be made whole? Rise, take up thy bed, and walk.
The man he cured here, Christians said, 400 or 500 years later, you could actually see the bed on the wall. It must have been like Lourdes, covered in crutches and wheelchairs of people who have been healed. It's a very ancient tradition that Jesus is joining. But the fascinating thing about this is that until the 1960s, when the archaeologists started to dig this up, those passages were really unexplained in the Bible, just a wimbly-wombly story. Now they're actually verified by these very stones around me. Archaeology has really revolutionised our view of the New Testament. When you touch a stone that archaeologists have dug up, and you try and connect it to something in the New Testament, if it's there, you find the stone is dead right. The people that wrote the 4 Gospels were really there in 1st century Palestine. They knew the place. They knew Bethlehem, Jerusalem, Nazareth. All the archaeologists have dug up absolutely confirms them to the smallest details. These guys knew which flowers were in the field. They knew how fishermen went on in 1st century Galilee. It's absolutely true and correct. Does that, however, prove the existence of Jesus, the Christ, the Son of God? Well, in 100 years' time, somebody digs up the Berlin Wall. Is that going to prove the existence of James Bond? Of course it isn't. What you've got then in the New Testament is this extraordinary tension between very accurate and often banal, precise detail and this miraculous character walking through it.
And what you really need to join those two things together, still now, is not archaeology, but a leap of faith.
One thing's sure, however, unlike Homer's Troy, no one's ever had to find Jerusalem. Armies have been fighting over this most ancient, holy city for 4,000 years and more. And to this day, archaeologists cannot excavate the Holy Mount. Here, uninvited archaeology means war. Not surprisingly then, many archaeologists have chosen to dig outside the city walls, upon the very hill, the Bible tells, where the palace of King David stood.
And it came to pass, in an evening tide, that David arose from his bed and walked upon the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman washing herself, and the woman was very beautiful to look upon. And David sent and inquired after the woman. And one said, "Is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" And David sent for her.
A century of excavation on this little hill has shown us that the modern Arab village just across the valley looks much like its ancient predecessor must have done 3,000 years ago. You can still peep into your neighbour's house here, just as the biblical King David did.
If David and if Solomon ever lived, this hole in the ground would have been their tomb. Might not look much, but it's dead right for an ancient Jewish tomb, as you read about in the Bible. Modern archaeologists have found lots of these quite recently. You see, this little shelf here would have come out here a bit further with some stones. This is where you laid bodies, people that had just died. When they'd rotted, the bones would be pushed into the darkness at the back of the tomb. There, they would have gathered up with their ancestors, quite literally. Now, why is this a royal tomb? Well, Archaeology and the book together tell you that. This is a typical Israelite tomb, it's true, but it's gigantic. And the Bible, if you believe it, tells us that the palace was just down the road. So that combination of book and archaeology gives you the identification.
Yet we still lack solid evidence that King David ever lived at all. And that's Old Testament archaeology in a nutshell, really. Though hundreds of archaeologists have excavated all over the Bible's ancient world, they found very little direct evidence of its holy heroes. Sometimes, though, but very rarely, the shades of minor Bible characters appear to touch the living world of archaeology. Most recently in the 1970s, when Israelis digging on this so-called Hill of David found short texts bearing the names of ancient scribes, names that also appear in the Bible's book of Jeremiah.
Then read Baruch in the book the words of Jeremiah in the house of the Lord, in the chamber of Gemariah, the son of Shaphan the scribe, in the higher court, at the entry of the new gate of the Lord's house, in the ears of all the people.
You know, I first came here when this dig was still underway, before it had been tarted up, before there were fences around it. Before, too, there were Israeli settlers here. This was an Arab village then. Archaeology here really had a key role in this. See what they found here? The house of an Israelite scribe. The scribe, son of Shaphan, from the time of King Joachim, mentioned in the book of Jeremiah. So this is a moment really when archaeology and the book comes together and is a very powerful, if not lethal, mixture to the Palestinian village that was here. Even this sign's become a battlefield. Look at it. As soon as this sign went up saying that there have been Israelite things found here, people are pounded at it. Put the sign up in different languages. People scratched the Arabic out and wrote Israel underneath. This is archaeology and books fermenting. It's at the root of modern society here. The elegant Rockefeller Museum in Old Jerusalem seems to hold no faith within it whatsoever. We're back in the dry desert again, where scientific facts are slowly gathered from the ground, fragment by fragment. But is this really a strict scientific history of the Holy Land, compiled by archaeologists following in Flinders Petrie's footsteps, a past ordered not by books or faith, but by a simple scientific system? No, not really, it isn't. For archaeologists to make history from the broken past, they must give it shape and form, just as the writers of the ancient books had done so many years before them. Here, the form is the one adopted in the 1920s, at the urging of one of Petrie's pupils. It's the old European scheme, the stone, the bronze and the Iron Ages, a history based on modern ideas of human progress. Since then, however, Israeli archaeologists have made another scheme, one based upon incidents in the Hebrew Bible, moving archaeology right back to the stories of the Holy Book again. There are scientific truths here, though, lying in the dusty cases. They show that the greater part of the excavated past consists of random, broken things, things that at their very best provide haphazard snapshots of usually anonymous ancient lives. So there's nothing in archaeology at all of King David or of Christ or of the Trojan heroes either. The inspiration of both Schliemann and the biblical archaeologists, that who can dig up real evidence and relics of ancient books, is still the distant dream. Flinders Petrie died at a great age in Jerusalem in 1942 and was buried in Mount Zion Cemetery, surrounded by Protestant preachers, colonial administrators, and many of his friends and pupils. So this is where Flinders Petrie lies, or at least most of him does. At his own wish, his head was cut off and sent to London to aid in scientific research. It's a bit of a difference from Heinrich Schliemann's grave, isn't it? That great turn-of-the-century grandiose pile in Athens Cemetery. But these two men had a great deal in common. They were both natural-born archaeologists. These are people with phenomenal memories, well beyond the range of most of us, with immense energy, people who looked into the ground to try and piece things together, measuring, quantifying, working things out. The difference between the two of them lies in their attitude to books. Schliemann simply believed ancient books. He went to Troy to dig up Homer's heroes. When Petrie dug, though, he dug with scientific method into the ground and then wrote books which were scientifically based on his researches. That's the essential difference. And you know, Petrie's method is so persuasive that the nuttiest guy who comes here to Israel today to dig up balmy bits of the Bible cloaks his balminess in pseudoscience that Petrie laid down for him. So between these two men, you might say, between Schliemann and Petrie, is the birth of archaeology. One saw it born, the other was really its first flowering.